What if the most dangerous force in your life isn't fate itself, but the moment you try to avoid it? Because in the story of Oedipus, the real tension isn't about what will happen. It's about something far more unsettling, the possibility that every attempt to escape a predicted outcome might already be part of the mechanism that ensures it happens. That idea creates a rupture in how we normally understand choice. A cognitive gap that doesn't close easily. But here's the question that changes everything. If you were told, with absolute certainty, that a specific outcome would happen in your life, would you still be free to avoid it? Or would every decision you make after that moment simply become a reaction inside a system you no longer control? The world of Oedipus doesn't answer that question directly. It builds something more uncomfortable instead, a reality where knowledge doesn't liberate, it constrains. Where awareness doesn't expand possibility, it narrows it. And that's the first contradiction we have to sit with. We assume knowledge increases freedom. More information, better decisions. That's the modern belief system. But here, knowledge behaves like a trap. The more you understand the structure of your destiny, the more your behavior begins to align with it, almost as if understanding is just another form of participation. And that creates then the real instability appears, not in what is known, but in what cannot stop being interpreted. Because once the system begins to operate through interpretation loops, even silence becomes meaningful. Even absence becomes evidence. And in that kind of structure, certainty does not collapse suddenly. It slowly reorganizes itself into something unrecognizable as certainty. So here is the question that defines this phase of crisis. If every interpretation reshapes the outcome it is trying to understand, then is there any position from which reality can be observed without altering it? At this point, the world surrounding Oedipus stops behaving like a sequence of events and starts behaving like a closed cognitive system. Not a chain of actions, but a loop of meaning. Each attempt to escape the loop strengthens its structure, not because of force, but because of coherence. And that creates a deeper contradiction. We assume crisis happens when control is lost. But here, crisis emerges when control becomes too consistent. When every possible action fits too well into a predicted pattern, unpredictability itself disappears. And without unpredictability, choice stops feeling like choice at all. Memory fragment, the moment of recognition that clarity does not always expand possibility. Sometimes clarity reduces the number of possible worlds until only one remains visible, and that single visibility begins to feel like inevitability. Now escalation becomes unavoidable. Because if interpretation is the mechanism that stabilizes the system, then contradiction is not a failure of understanding. It is a feature of the system maintaining itself. Every conflicting reading, every alternative explanation, does not break the loop. It deepens it by increasing the density of meaning around it. This is where influence shifts from prophecy to cognition itself. The so-called warning is no longer external. It becomes internalized structure. And once internalized, it stops being something you respond to and becomes something you reproduce. Another memory fragment surfaces, the paradox of the observer who cannot remain outside what they observe. The act of analysis changes the object, but the object also changes the analyst. There is no neutral position left. And this leads to a critical escalation in consequence. If every attempt to understand a system modifies that system, then understanding is no longer passive. It becomes participation. And participation, once recognized, cannot be reversed. Awareness itself becomes irreversible action. So the core conflict intensifies beyond fate versus free will. It becomes something sharper, whether cognition itself is capable of stepping outside the structures it generates. At the level of Thebes, this appears as a myth of destiny. At the level of cognition, it becomes a structural question about whether human thought can ever escape self-reference. Because once thought begins to observe itself, it becomes both the map and the territory at the same time. And here is the escalation that cannot be ignored. If identity is formed through interpretation, and interpretation is shaped by expectation, then identity is not something discovered. It is something continuously constructed by feedback loops that never fully stabilize. Which means the system does not need to predict a final outcome. It only needs to maintain a stable process of self-confirming meaning. And that is where the most unsettling implication begins to emerge. What if the illusion is not choice itself, but the belief that there ever was a moment when choice was separate from interpretation? Because if that separation never existed, then the entire structure of escape, resistance, and avoidance may already be embedded inside the system it is trying to escape. Memory fragment, the reversal of agency, where the attempt to avoid a pattern becomes the most precise expression of that pattern. And now we reach a threshold where the system begins to fold inward. If every attempt to resist is also an expression of the thing being resisted, then what exactly counts as resistance at all? And in that collapsing boundary between action and interpretation, a larger mystery begins to surface, one that no longer belongs only to myth, but to the structure of thought itself. Then the structure finally reveals what it has been doing all along, but not in the way anyone inside the system would expect. Because at this stage, the question is no longer whether interpretation shapes reality. The question becomes, what kind of structure allows interpretation to feel like freedom while still producing consistent outcomes? And that is where the revelation begins to surface. The system surrounding Oedipus is not built on prediction alone. It is built on something more fundamental, constrained self-generation. Not a single path written in advance, but a field of possible actions where every option already contains its own consequence structure embedded within it. Revelation, the illusion of choice, does not come from external control. It comes from internal consistency. Every decision feels free because it logically aligns with the identity that makes it. And that changes everything. Because identity is not separate from the system. Identity is the system. A continuously updating model that must remain coherent even while producing contradictions. So what appears as choice is actually coherence maintenance under pressure. The mind is not selecting from infinite possibilities. It is eliminating everything that would break its own narrative stability. Memory fragment, the moment a crown becomes heavier not because of its weight, but because it defines the only posture the body is allowed to hold. From here, insight deepens. If identity functions as a coherence engine, then every interpretation is filtered through one requirement: does this preserve who I believe I am? And if the answer is no, the interpretation is rejected before it ever becomes action. This means the boundary of freedom is not external constraint, but internal coherence enforcement. Consequences begin to expand. Under this structure, even resistance becomes identity-preserving behavior. Even rebellion must conform to a recognizable self-model. So what looks like breaking the system is often just another way of reinforcing it. Not because of fate, but because of structural necessity inside cognition itself. And this is where scale shifts dramatically. This is no longer about mythological inevitability. This becomes a model of human cognition under narrative pressure. Societies, individuals, even belief systems operate as coherence fields. They do not simply respond to truth. They absorb truth only when it can be made consistent with their internal architecture. Memory fragment, the image of a mirror that does not reflect appearance, but reflects what must remain unchanged for the reflection to still feel like self. And now the system reveals a deeper implication. If coherence is the requirement for identity, then truth is not evaluated by accuracy alone. It is evaluated by whether it can be integrated without collapsing the structure that receives it. This means that truth is not an absolute force. It is a negotiated survival condition between information and identity. And this creates a subtle but powerful consequence: the more rigid the identity, the less truth it can tolerate. The more flexible the identity, the more unstable it becomes. So stability and openness begin to work against each other. At this point, the core conflict shifts again. It is no longer fate versus free will. It is coherence versus transformation. The ability to remain oneself versus the ability to become something else. And that leads to the final unfolding question. If every system of thought must preserve itself in order to continue existing, then is the illusion of choice actually a side effect of survival, or is survival itself the original structure that generates the illusion of choice in the first place? Then the system stops behaving like a sequence of outcomes and starts revealing itself as something more fundamental, a self-stabilizing structure that cannot allow contradiction to exist without immediately transforming it into coherence. And the deeper question emerges from that instability. If every interpretation is absorbed and restructured to preserve internal consistency, then what exactly would it take for a system like this to ever break? The answer is not external force. It is structural impossibility. Because at the center of Oedipus lies a mechanism that does not rely on prediction, control, or even awareness. It relies on something far more stable, the necessity of identity to remain intelligible to itself at every moment of its existence. Core revelation, the so-called illusion of choice, is not an illusion created by limitation, but an emergent property of coherence maintenance. Every action feels autonomous because it must remain compatible with the self-model that produces it. Freedom is not removed from the system. It is continuously redefined inside the boundaries of what the system can still recognize as me. And once this becomes visible, the entire framework collapses into a single unified insight. The conflict was never between fate and freedom. It was between change and continuity of self-definition. Insight expansion, every decision is not a selection between possibilities, but a negotiation between identity preservation and potential transformation. The mind does not ask, what can I do? It asks, often, unconsciously, what can I do without becoming someone I do not recognize? Memory fragment, the image of a traveler standing at a crossroads where every road leads forward, but only one road allows the traveler to remain the same person upon arrival. This is the hidden architecture beneath the myth. The tragedy is not that Oedipus is forced into a destiny. The tragedy is that any deviation from the unfolding structure would require him to abandon the very identity that defines his ability to choose in the first place. Choice is always filtered through the requirement of self-recognition. Consequences begin to sharpen. If identity stability is the invisible constraint behind all decisions, then transformation is not simply difficult. It is cognitively expensive. It requires breaking coherence, dissolving narrative continuity, and temporarily existing without a stable internal reference point. Most systems, human or societal, avoid this state because it feels indistinguishable from collapse. Scale shift, what appears in myth as prophecy is mirrored in modern life as psychological inertia. Careers, relationships, beliefs, even personal ambition, each persists not because it is destined, but because it preserves a continuous story of who someone believes they are. Memory fragment, a sealed manuscript that rewrites itself every time it is opened, ensuring the reader always finds a version consistent with what they already believe the story to be. And now the philosophical layer becomes unavoidable. If every system preserves itself through coherence, then even transformation must disguise itself as continuity to be accepted. Change is not the opposite of identity. It is identity slowly renegotiating its own boundaries without ever admitting rupture. This leads to a final structural realization. What we called escape from fate may simply be the system redefining what escape means so that it remains within the limits of self-preservation. And if that is true, then every perceived liberation is not outside the system, but an internal rearrangement that maintains the system's survival. So the question is no longer whether fate exists. The question becomes far more unsettling. If every form of freedom must first pass through the requirement of self-preservation, then can any transformation ever be truly independent of the identity that is being transformed? Then what remains after the structure stabilizes is not resolution, but residue. A lingering effect where every outcome feels inevitable in hindsight, yet every decision still feels voluntary in the moment it is made. And that tension is where consequence begins to evolve into something deeper than story. It becomes inheritance. Because once the internal system reaches equilibrium, nothing truly disappears. It only becomes absorbed into the logic that survives it. And that is where the consequences of Oedipus extend beyond the individual. Not as punishment, but as structural memory embedded into how meaning organizes itself after collapse. The first consequence is psychological. When a mind is forced to operate under continuous coherence pressure, it begins to prioritize narrative stability over experiential truth. This means reality is not processed as raw input, but as something that must immediately fit into an existing self-model. Over time, this creates a subtle narrowing, not of perception, but of interpretive range. You still see everything, but you can only understand it in ways that preserve continuity. Memory fragment, the image of a sealed lens that becomes clearer the more it filters out what cannot be translated into familiarity. The second consequence expands outward. In any system shaped by this logic, knowledge does not accumulate neutrally. It accumulates selectively. Information that disrupts identity is either reinterpreted or silently excluded. And over time, what remains is not a fuller understanding of reality, but a more stable version of it. Stability replaces accuracy as the primary function of thought. This is where legacy begins to form. Not as a story that ends, but as a pattern that repeats itself in different contexts. The legacy of this structure is not confined to myth. It becomes a cognitive inheritance passed into how humans construct certainty in uncertain environments. Every culture that values coherence over contradiction inherits a fragment of this mechanism. Scale shift, what begins as a mythological framework becomes a blueprint for psychological survival. Individuals learn, often unconsciously, that maintaining internal consistency feels safer than confronting truths that destabilize identity. Societies replicate the same principle at scale, preferring narratives that unify perception even when they simplify complexity. Memory fragment, a statue that remains intact not because it is strong, but because every crack has been filled with material that matches its original shape so perfectly that the damage becomes invisible. And yet, this legacy carries an embedded cost. The cost is not ignorance. It is rigidity disguised as understanding. A system optimized for coherence slowly loses its ability to recognize when coherence itself becomes a limitation. It no longer detects when adaptation is required, because adaptation is interpreted as threat to identity rather than evolution of it. This creates a deeper reflection. If every system preserves itself by filtering transformation through stability, then what appears as growth may actually be controlled repetition of acceptable change. Not evolution, but curated variation within fixed boundaries. And this is where the philosophical weight intensifies. Because under this structure, even the idea of learning from experience becomes complicated. Learning does not necessarily expand the system. It often reinforces it by refining what is already acceptable within its internal model. Experience does not break identity. It strengthens the rules that define it. Memory fragment, the echo of a closed room where every sound eventually returns, slightly altered, but never enough to escape the room itself. So the legacy of this mechanism is not a single tragic outcome. It is the persistence of a principle that systems survive not by embracing truth in its raw form, but by transforming truth into something they can continue to be. And this leads to the final expansion of consequence. If survival depends on the continuous rewriting of meaning to preserve identity, then the boundary between truth and adaptation begins to dissolve. What remains is not clarity, but a living negotiation between what can be known and what can be endured. And the question that emerges from that inheritance is no longer about fate or freedom. It becomes something more unstable, more persistent, and still unresolved. If every system survives by reshaping reality into something it can remain coherent with, then what part of reality ever remains untouched by the need to be understood? In the end, what remains is not the story that was told, but the way the mind continues to tell it long after it has ended. Because the deepest realization is not about whether outcomes are fixed or fluid. It is about the fact that human understanding itself cannot exist without building structure around uncertainty. And that structure always comes at a cost. Final insight, meaning is not something discovered inside reality. It is something reality is continuously reshaped into so that the mind can remain coherent within it. And once that becomes visible, everything associated with Oedipus stops feeling like ancient tragedy and starts feeling like a mirror of cognition itself. Not a story about a cursed individual, but a demonstration of how consciousness preserves itself by turning uncertainty into narrative form. Legacy is not what the character leaves behind. Legacy is what continues to operate after the character is gone. And in this case, what remains is a pattern of thought that refuses to accept randomness without transforming it into meaning. a psychological inheritance where the mind would rather accept a structured illusion than endure unstructured reality. Memory fragment, the image of a door that only locks after it has already been opened, as if understanding itself completes the mechanism that prevents return. This is the human meaning embedded beneath the myth. The tragedy is not the event itself, but the realization that interpretation is never neutral. Every attempt to understand is also an act of shaping what can be understood next. And that means the observer is never separate from the system being observed. So what this story ultimately reveals is not a broken system of fate, but a continuous negotiation between uncertainty and coherence. A negotiation so constant that it feels invisible, because it is identical to thought itself. And this is where reflection turns inward. If every mind organizes reality through structures that preserve its own continuity, then even truth cannot exist outside that requirement. It must pass through the filter of what can be integrated without dissolving identity. Which means that what we call understanding is always a compromise between reality as it is, and reality as it must appear to remain survivable to consciousness. Memory fragment, the echo of a face in still water that changes not when the water is disturbed, but when the observer insists on recognizing themselves within it. So the legacy of this entire framework is not determinism, and not freedom. It is the recognition that both concepts may only exist as tools the mind uses to stabilize experience long enough to continue functioning within it. And once that is seen clearly, the question no longer belongs to myth, or even to philosophy in the traditional sense. It belongs to perception itself. If every form of understanding requires reshaping what is understood in order to preserve coherence, then what would reality look like if it were never required to be understood at all?